morning, good morning. Transitions, to me, always sound like kind of predictable, orderly processes, and they can be, but more often than not, they are not. So I want to ask you some questions. Have you been maybe going through some changes and wondering kind of what's going on? Anybody feeling a little disoriented like me coming back into San Miguel? Maybe you're searching for answers and you're kind of coming up short. You could be going through a transition. Transition is when you're forced to evolve past where you are, what you are, who you are in the moment. During a transition, life is changing. Things are ending and new things are possible. They will be, but you have to kind of figure out what those are. During a transition, nothing you do changes the circumstances. You're transitioning. That's just a fact. Father Richard Rohr, who's an ecumenist, he's the founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, said we become what we're willing to see. And that's what you're going to hear a little bit about today when Wilka Roig talks about transitions and choice. Philosopher Paul Brunton said, what we were in the past is not so important. What we are now is important, and what we intend to make of ourselves is vitally important to our future. He speaks of choice, going on to say the unity between character and destiny is inseparable. The connection between our way of thinking and the course of events is unerring. So that can give you a little bit of calm. Transitions and choice is Wilka's topic. She's the Deputy Director of Education for the global Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. She, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, was the author of the international best-selling book On Death and Dying, which explained the 5 stages of grief. How many people have read that book? Many of us have been helped by that. For her work, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and named by Time magazine as one of 100 most important thinkers of the 20th century. Her son, Ken Ross, founded the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation and is a personal friend and colleague of Wilka's. Wilka herself is the founder and curriculum developer of the first life, death, and transition school in Latin America. Please help me welcome, sir, my friend and colleague and mentor, Wilka Roig, who will share that your choices could improve your day and your future. Her associate, Marisol, is here with her today and will be snapping photos, so give her a little bit of leeway in case she's with you. They're going to, afterward, be right outside to renew their friendships with so many of you. How many of you know Wilka? Yeah, thought so. And they will answer any questions you have at that time. Welcome, Wilka.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to finally be here with you. I've heard about the Rotary forever. It has been a mystery to me, and I had the honor of being invited last week and to find old friends, new friends, and what an amazing community. I love it. So thank you so much for having me. So I've prepared a slide presentation for us that will be helpful to me also. So we were thinking about what can we bring today to talk about as we prepare for the Days of the Dead, and what does that mean to us? And as part of the sort of vision and philosophy of the Foundation, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and my personal mission, we are constantly moving through cycles of sort of life, death life is what I call them. You know, there are necessary deaths that need to happen in order for new life to begin. And so from where I stand, every day, every moment, and our whole lives are made up of transitions. And if we are able to recognize that and then realize that we have agency in collaborating with transition, then all the better. So next slide. Thank you. So just a little definition of what I understand to be transition. It is a combination of loss and gain plus inevitable change. And what do I mean by loss and gain, right? So sometimes good things happen as we look at things as good or bad, perhaps, or desirable or not desirable. something good could happen, like a change in jobs or a move into something new, a relationship or a new venture. With something that we gain, inevitably there's something that was left behind. And we tend to forget that these two always come together. So we gain something, we lose something. Or the opposite side, we lose something, but there's an opportunity for gain. And so to look at both of those together already is a great choice that we can make. So every transition is an initiation. It's an invitation to collaborate with the necessary change, right? So for every single thing that needs to happen, it is inherent in the idea of change that it cannot stay the same, right? So if we understand and accept the fact that we're being asked to change, to let go of something, to release something in order to make room for something, then we'll do better. Because when we resist change, what happens, right? We're miserable. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you've all heard change is the only constant in life. And then I found this, which I think is terribly redacted. I don't know if that's the right word. Oh yeah, there you go. You put the, thank you. I don't even know if Benjamin Franklin said this, but I love that there's this quote that says, one's ability to adapt to those changes will determine one's success in life. So I just wanted to sort of bring this back into sort of the context of our conversation. Next slide, please. So on top of the fact that life is made up of transitions, we are also meaning-making creatures, right? So we are constantly trying to make sense of what's happening, sense of what happened, in order to get a sense of where we're going. And one of the things that this particular person reminds us is that it's important for us to think about what motivates us to strive, what is it that we fear and why why exactly are we like finding a purpose in our lives is part of this whole process of making meaning. Anyway, next slide, please. And this is a very long quote. I don't expect you to read it, but this is Stephen Jenkinson, who I think is one of the great minds of our times, and I highly recommend his readings and videos. But the main point of this is that meaning is something that we make. It's not something we find, but something that we make. So there's agency and choice in how we choose to make sense of what is happening, again, what happened, and where we may be going from there. So we have a serious responsibility, both with ourselves and beyond ourselves, which is the other part about choice. We're not just here to think about what is happening to me, but how within a larger context, how is what happens to me affect or benefit not just the world around me now, but future generations, right? Next slide, please. So, just to summarize the previous slide. So, meaning is made by the willingness to proceed, because certain things must be, because life continues. And it's not to say that we are minimizing the experiences, the difficulties, the challenges, the losses, but that there's also that openness to the other side of the picture. We are tending towards, we're conditioned socially to assume that bad things are just bad and good things are just good, and that we better just want and strive for the good and avoid the bad. Well, what I'm inviting you to do here and how we can exert our choice is to say, no, these are always intertwined. They are always together. And if we can look at it from that standpoint, a lot can transform. So then, Stephen Jenkinson invites us to consider that everything that begins will end, and that every ending brings the possibility of new beginnings. And he invites us to not just accept that there will be endings, or to be aware that with anything that begins, it's inherent that something is ending, but that we fall in love with it. How can we develop a courtship and a romance with the fact that everything that begins will end? Because then we can be more graceful with what comes with the endings, right? Which, no beginnings. All right, next slide. So, we are all going to go through transitions, and transitions will definitely bring challenges. I'm sure every single person here has already experienced many of those, right? So, part of what we can be aware of so that we can have choice in the matter is to recognize that the challenge is completely related to how attached we are to the way things were, right? The moment that we are resisting the change because what we had or what we thought was right is the only option that we can imagine. So that's one of the things that we need to address, right? And the other is because there's challenge, but then there's also suffering, which is beyond the natural pain of change when we generate suffering out of the situation. And that has to do with two things: the unfinished business, things that are still left unattended from that thing that's ending, and our resistance to what could be, right? The most uncomfortable thing that we all know is not knowing, right? So having to be forced into that dark space of, I don't know who I am, I don't know what I'm doing here, I don't know where I'm going, that's what leads us to have resistance, right? So we rather stay where we already know or jump to some perfect vision of a future and not actually go through the darkness that is required. Next slide, please. So what is the path of choice? That's where we come in. We're all going to go through transition. Inevitably, in order to grow, we have to change. So our work is in learning to transform resistance into surrender, into graceful acceptance. It's, it sounds like perfectly beautiful, right? But it is a process. Transform attachment into unconditional love. So unconditional love is the medicine for everything. And it is an opportunity we have every moment of every day, starting with ourselves, with how we feel, how we wake up in the morning, with our pets, with the neighbor, with everything. We have always the option to choose to be more unconditionally loving with ourselves and others. And that helps us to be a little bit lighter about our attachments. I like to practice, when, let's say, something happens, like I drop a glass and it breaks. I like to practice in moments like those, or when I suddenly can't find my keys. Those are simple moments of transition where we can practice safely about accepting what we would rather not be, right? Like, where's my phone? So learning to get more comfortable with the unexpected and the unfamiliar. So ultimately, when are we not comfortable? When we don't know what's going on, right? So how can we begin to find comfort in discomfort? We can all find different ways to practice that. And I'm a proponent of practicing with very simple things. I can't think of, well, even losing your phone can be uncomfortable, right? So that's one we can all relate to. So then we have to begin to learn to flow with change and allow it to let ourselves be unprepared, right? We have been trained to assume that we better be prepared for everything. This morning, many people said, "Are you ready?" And I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to show up and then see what is needed here with this beautiful group. And I have some ideas of what I might be talking about, but ultimately I'm gonna respond to you, right? So let's be comfortable in the discomfort of not knowing exactly what, of not being fully prepared, of being willing to show up and be present with what is. And falling in love with endings, my favorite. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, that nothing is negative. You could sit with that and daily and be like, how can I make sense of, make meaning of what is happening as not negative? And she says, it's all an opportunity to grow, and it is the sole purpose of our existence. So to think about things outside of this positive, negative, good, bad, desirable, undesirable, one of my teachers always said, how is this moment an answer to your prayers? Especially difficult times. How can we make meaning of something and choose to see it beyond the immediate assumption that it's bad and therefore uncomfortable and therefore I'm going to suffer? Next slide, please. So there's a purpose to transition. We could look at it that way, right? Of course, we're meaning-making creatures. So we want to make sense of transition and discomfort, and so we find a purpose for it. So life is a constant transition, if we think about it. From moment to moment, we are constantly transitioning into something that we don't know, and then we become familiar with it, and then we take one more step, and then go into another thing that we don't know until we become familiar with that, and then so on, yes? And this is how we grow, this is how we learn, this is how we build experience and a sense of comfort and confidence in being in the world. So growth and evolution can only happen through change. New possibilities can only be found in that dark mystery of the unfamiliar, that in the middle of the life-death life cycles. So, when we talk about creativity, for example, we cannot come up with something new unless we step out of what we already know, right? So in order to truly be creative, we have to go into that edge of what we know, what already exists, and into the dark mystery, in order to discover, come up with, invent, generate something new. So it's the same thing. We can look at transitions as the way life continues to create and regenerate. Next slide, please. There it is, maybe? So I use this term, I learned it from Dr. Clarissa Pincola Estes, who's one of my teachers. She likes to refer to life as the life-death life cycles, also as a way of sort of breaking that taboo that to talk about death is bad, because life is a cycle of, sort of endings and beginnings, right? But we don't want to use the word death. So she kind of is like, let's just use it. And let's get comfortable with the discomfort of that, yes. Okay, so with each transition, a part of us is forced to change. So we can no longer behave the same. We can no longer just say the same things we said before and they make sense. And the way we react and the way we relate just isn't the same. Depending on what the situation is and what the transition is, there's a way in which we can just no longer be exactly the way we were. And that's part of this death part, right? It's a symbolic death. It sometimes feels quite literal, right? And then, during a transition, we are forced to reconsider who I was. Did I like it? Did it work? Did it not work? Should I change some things? What do I think will be better, or what have I learned will be better? My priorities also change. This is always a constant invitation for life review. So there's something sort of death-like about it, because we are sort of preparing to leave many things behind in order to move forward. And with each transition, there's that opportunity for transformation and renewal. Next slide, please. So, just to reiterate, it is an invitation to revisit and review our lives, to reconsider our priorities, to let some things go, to allow for change, make new choices, revise our definition of who we are and why we are here. And it prepares us to move forward as more authentic and more whole versions of ourselves. So with every symbolic death, let's say, as we are born into what is next, we get rid of those things that are not aligned with our truths or who we really are, right? A lot of things we carry are things that we were told that we should be, or expectations from, different structures. And so then we become more ourselves, right? And that's the beauty of transition and of evolution and growth. Next slide. So here's another quote from Elisabeth, that we will finally realize that life is a school that puts us through these different levels and these different tests and these special lessons that bring us closer to the manifestation of our highest potential, right? And so that's the beauty of being alive and going through transition and embracing losses and all of these things. Next slide. So, and this is where it gets really interesting, because in transition, we also, especially when we think it's something really bad, let's take an example of a great loss, whether it's the loss of, somebody dear, or even, something that had a lot of meaning for us, or of a house or something, whatever it is, those moments that are so challenging and so life-changing also bring with them inexplicable peak experiences. And we don't talk about that enough. We may be completely lost and not know what to do, and suddenly this very unexpected thing happens, right? Suddenly, somehow, out of nowhere, someone comes in and offers an opportunity that you never had imagined, or you walk down the street and bump into a situation that opens doors for you. These things happen, and they happen more often than we allow ourselves to recognize. And so I'm also here to invite you to make the choice to be perceptive and open to receiving that, because there is a way in which the more we are willing to collaborate with the darkness and the unknown of transition, the more those things are right there. Sometimes it's something really sweet, like getting on the bus and the song that's playing is a song that has great meaning to you, and it just gives you just enough of that, whatever, oomph to get to the next step, right? But then sometimes it's incredible miracles that happen, and we don't talk about that often enough. So I just wanted to bring that up, and that they are generally dismissed because we have been conditioned to believe that life is hard, that everything requires a lot of work, and that if you don't make it happen, it's not going to happen. And so we don't make room for beautiful things to just happen and to sort of guide us through. Next slide, please. Yes, so these transpersonal aspects, I'm a transpersonal psychologist, so that's a term that we use to explain that which is beyond the personal, and which is, I think, a more inclusive term than speaking specifically about, spiritual things, which is fine too, but then these are the things that usher the way, guide through the transformation. And so it's my invitation for you to be aware of, I'll tell you in a second. But there's also something about those magical moments that we experience that allow for us to have the strength to navigate. I've said this already, so next slide. I get ahead of myself sometimes. Yeah, so both of these things are integral to our human experience. And I'm here to invite us all to remember to carry both and hold hands with both. And, the challenging part and the inspiring part of transition. And that these things show up generally sometimes in dreams or visions or extrasensory perceptions. Maybe we think we heard something, and even if we didn't hear it, it meant something to us. Synchronicities and symbolic occurrences that happen, like suddenly one day you hear the name of a person 3 times or something like that, that you can't avoid noticing that something's going on there, right? So I invite you to pay attention to your dreams and to pay more attention to your surroundings and to nature, and to not the way we usually are looking at and experiencing our world. Allow yourself to not always respond with the same answer to how are you today. Let yourself sort of, what is that word? Improvise, or, be like open mic about it and see what you discover about yourself instead of going to the same fine, thank you, and you. Next slide, please. So here's another quote, Elisabeth. I love her very much. She's just saying, just because we don't understand things, it doesn't mean we need to dismiss them. So I'm inviting you to also embrace those things that you cannot understand. Next slide, please. So, yeah, I guess I'm a little redundant. Again, I'm just saying that all of these experiences are complementing, and then they are opening up the space for the lightness that also comes with transition, right? When we are so focused with the challenge and the pain and the frustration and the irritation and the exhaustion, then it's harder to move forward or to get up in the morning or to do what we need to do. But when we allow these spaces of magic, then there's more of a balance. Next slide. So here's another quote from Elisabeth, and it's quite an intense one, but I wanted to put it in here because we are meaning-making creatures, And we can always look back at all of the tragedies that we have survived and make sense of them and learn lessons from them. And so she says, whatever that horrible thing that you went through, and we all have gone through horrible things. That's another thing. We go around walking around pretending that none of us have gone through horrible things, but we all have, and pretty deep, intense ones. So at least we need to make room for that. And in fact, admire everybody that we've survived and that we're all here today. Yeah, life can be hard sometimes. So all of it, it was with the intention to grow in understanding, to grow in love, and to grow in all of those things which we still have to learn. And next slide, please. Yeah. So another thing I just wanted to invite you to recognize is that when we are in transition, there's a way in which we are not quite here. We are somewhere in between the worlds of life and death and life and who we were and who we will become. And so there's something about our state of consciousness that's a little bit altered. You know, sometimes we bump into things and suddenly we don't remember certain things, or we can't stay focused, we have foggy brain. But somehow that allows for us to have a greater receptivity for these magical things that I was mentioning to you. So, yes, so within that state where we're not so fully in control, we cannot be in control. If you notice, all these symptoms when we're in transition make us so that we're less able to just logically try to solve things. They allow for us to be able to connect more with our intuition and to connect more with that capacity for connection and recognition that we somehow are all in it together. Next slide, please. Yes, so it is when we are in that state where we are not thinking straight, quote unquote, that we can then do those things that I showed you earlier of what we need to learn in order to flow with change. And this is when and where and how it is easier for us to be able to collaborate consciously, to have an intention to say, okay, things are changing, things are dying, new things will be coming. I will give in to that. Next slide. So I just wanted to invite you to think about this so that you can begin to think about and recognize it in yourselves, right? Each of us have our unique ways in which we experience change. But there is one thing that I've noticed, regardless of what kind of change you're going through, from preparing for a change in life, like graduation, marriage, divorce, retirement, whatever, to when somebody is just given birth, is a new mother, to when we are going through like a really big life transition, terminal illness, all these things, that we all go through some or all of these. So there are energy changes, mood changes, brain fog, digestive changes, changes in appetite, in sleeping patterns. We have increased dream recall sometimes, or we start to hear and see things. Some people have that experience. We have a higher sensitivity to external stimuli, and we have a tendency to isolate and turn inward, right? So we can see across the board that we all have these experiences when we are going through transition, when something is changing, when things are no longer the way they used to be. So when we experience any one of these, we could actually sort of get ahead of ourselves enough to say, something is changing. And maybe I don't even know what it is, but right now I can't sleep well, or I'm not eating the same, or I don't feel like getting out of bed, or I don't feel like talking or seeing anyone right now, talking to or seeing anyone. Let's just honor that. Take a moment, if you can, take a pause and say, okay, something's changing. What is it? And how can I collaborate with it? If we did this more often, we would have less issues with depression and other things like that, because we just don't make room for the necessary deaths that are happening in our lives so that we can become our highest potential. So with that, I am closing our presentation. I think the next slide is just, yes, choose to collaborate with change and intentionally engage with your life transitions. And I think there's one more slide. Because according to Elisabeth, and I agree with her, that the only reason why we're here is to learn to be unconditionally loving to ourselves and others. So thank you very much. Oh, okay. So, yes?
You started this presentation with talking about transitions being forced on you, like it happens
I think it's related because something else was changing that led us to think about our options and our possibilities, right? So in that process of whatever that transition was, one of the options or opportunities that came of it was, oh, I could move to San Miguel, right? So, and then of course we can make the choice intentionally and we can force our transition into whatever it is and then deal with the hurdles along the way, or we can sit with the unknowing for a little bit longer and feel more guided and more smoothly taken into whatever that next step is. But obviously we're always going to also have a choice and an agency about what the next step is. So I think they're related. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Can you tell us about Death Cafe?
Oh, sure. What do you want to know about Death Cafes? So,
I think a lot of people don't know about it, the way that you do it every month.
oh yeah. Okay, so Death Cafe is it's actually now an international movement. It was started by John Underwood in England I forget the names, the numbers. Like I think it was in 2011 that he started it, and then he died, and then his widow and his mother continued it, and now Death Cafes happen everywhere. So how it happened was that he was diagnosed with terminal leukemia, and he wanted to talk about it. And then he discovered that his family didn't want to hear about it, that it was not the topic of conversation at cocktail hour. So he decided then that maybe it would be safer to talk with strangers who are not invested or, have an expectation or a need about the well-being of the other person, because he needed to talk about the fact that he was dying and that he was facing his mortality. So he started these death cafes, inviting strangers into the coffee shop in the corner, have tea and cake, and talk about our feelings, thoughts, experiences with our mortality. And so now there are death cafes all over the world, and any person who agrees to the guidelines of Death Cafe can become an affiliate, so I am one. And we used to have death cafes in person until the pandemic, and so my death cafe moved online right now, so we're thinking about the foundation starting on one in person for us here. But basically, any person is welcome, and it's not a support group, and it's not for advice giving. It's a little bit more like just about holding space and just learning more about what is possible as human beings as we move through change and loss and face our mortality. Yep. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Wilka, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. It was a great speech, so thank you very much. We would like to give you this certificate. It's a certificate of appreciation for your presentation to our club. It's a donation of 10 polio immunizations. It will be made in your honor.
Thank
within your polio.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much.